On December 6, 1975, President Gerald Ford and Secretary of State Henry Kissinger left Jakarta, Indonesia, after a state visit. On December 7, 1975, Indonesia invaded East Timor. One day. The timing was not a coincidence. Ford and Kissinger had met with Indonesian President Suharto the day before the invasion. Suharto told them what he was planning. The declassified record of that meeting shows Kissinger's response. He asked Suharto to wait until after the American delegation had left the country. He got his wish. Over the next 24 years, Indonesian forces killed an estimated 100,000 to 200,000 people in East Timor, out of a population of roughly 650,000. Some estimates run higher. By some calculations, as much as a third of the entire population died. The United States supplied the weapons. Australia recognized the annexation. The United Nations passed resolutions that nobody enforced. And for 24 years, one of the deadliest genocides per capita of the 20th century unfolded on a small half-island that most of the world had never heard of, and that, decades later, most of the world still hasn't. East Timor occupies the eastern half of a small island in the Indonesian archipelago, sharing it with Indonesian-controlled West Timor. For over 400 years, it had been a Portuguese colony, one of the last remnants of Portugal's colonial empire, largely neglected, underdeveloped, and disconnected from the rapid decolonization that had transformed most of Southeast Asia after World War II. In 1974, Portugal's own authoritarian government collapsed in a military coup. The new Portuguese government began rapidly withdrawing from its remaining colonies, including East Timor. Local political parties formed. Frelimo, the Revolutionary Front for an Independent East Timor, emerged as the dominant political force, winning local support with a platform of independence. On November 28, 1975, Frelimo declared East Timor's independence. 9 days later, Indonesia invaded. Indonesia's interest in East Timor was strategic. President Suharto's government, the same government this channel covered in episode 31, the same government that had killed approximately 500,000 of its own citizens in the 1965-66 anti-communist purges, viewed an independent, left-leaning state on Indonesia's doorstep as a security threat and a potential model for separatist movements within Indonesia's own sprawling, ethnically diverse territory. There was also the matter of oil and gas reserves in the waters surrounding Timor, resources that would later become central to Australia's own calculations. On December 6, 1975, President Gerald Ford and Secretary of State Henry Kissinger arrived in Jakarta for a state visit with Suharto. The declassified record of their meeting, released by the National Security Archive decades later, documents the conversation directly. Suharto told Ford and Kissinger that Indonesia intended to invade East Timor. Kissinger's recorded response focused not on whether the invasion should happen, but on timing and optics. He expressed concern about the use of American-supplied weapons, given legal restrictions that required such weapons be used only for defensive purposes. He asked that the operation wait until after he and Ford had left Indonesian airspace. Ford and Kissinger departed Jakarta on December 6. Indonesian forces invaded East Timor on December 7. The invasion was immediate and overwhelming. Indonesian forces launched a combined land, sea, and air assault on Dili, East Timor's capital. From the first hours, the violence was directed at civilians as much as at Frelimo's poorly armed defenders. A Frelimo radio broadcast from the first day of the invasion has survived in the historical record. It said, "The Indonesian forces are killing indiscriminately. Women and children are being shot in the streets. We are all going to be killed. This is an appeal for international help. Please do something to stop this invasion." The international help did not come. The United Nations General Assembly passed a resolution 5 days after the invasion, condemning it and demanding Indonesian withdrawal. Indonesia did not withdraw. The resolution was never enforced. If this history is new to you, subscribe to Unsolved East and hit like. New episodes every week. What followed the invasion was not a brief military campaign. It was a 24-year occupation defined by systematic violence against the civilian population. Indonesian military strategy in East Timor combined direct massacre with a broader campaign of forced resettlement, destruction of food production, and what historians have described as a deliberate effort to break the population's capacity and will to resist. The pattern of violence in the early years of the occupation was documented in specific, verified incidents. In February 1976, Indonesian troops captured the village of Alu, south of the capital. Survivors and subsequent investigators documented that Indonesian forces machine-gunned most of the town's population, reportedly shooting everyone over the age of 3. The youngest children who survived were taken to Dili in trucks. Before the attack, Alu's population was approximately 5,000. When Indonesian relief workers visited the village in September 1976, 7 months later, only 1,000 people remained. In June 1976, Indonesian forces retaliated against a refugee camp at Lamaknan, near the West Timor border, after suffering losses in combat with Fretilin fighters. Soldiers set houses on fire and killed as many as 4,000 men, women, and children sheltering in the camp. These were not isolated atrocities. By March 1977, a former Australian consul named James Dunn had compiled a report documenting that Indonesian forces had killed between 50,000 and 100,000 East Timorese civilians in the 15 months since the invasion began. Beyond direct killing, the Indonesian military's counterinsurgency strategy included the forced resettlement of large portions of the rural population into controlled settlements, a strategy intended to separate civilians from Fretilin's guerrilla resistance, which had retreated to the island's mountainous interior. The forced resettlement, combined with the destruction of crops and agricultural infrastructure in contested areas, produced famine conditions across significant portions of the territory in the late 1970s. Starvation killed alongside bullets. Disease spread through overcrowded resettlement camps with inadequate food, water, and medical care. The arms. None of this occurred without external support. Between 1975 and 1980, the years when violence in East Timor reached its peak, the United States supplied approximately $340 million in weaponry to the Indonesian government. American officials were aware that U.S.-supplied weapons were legally restricted to defensive purposes under bilateral agreements. The State Department conducted a review. Kissinger, according to the declassified record, was frustrated by State Department staff who raised concerns about the arms sales, reportedly telling them that any written objections would be used against him later. Military aid continued. It continued through multiple American presidential administrations, Republican and Democratic, until 1999, when international pressure following a final wave of violence finally produced a cutoff. Australia's position was, in some respects, even more direct. In February 1979, Australia became the only Western country to officially recognize Indonesian sovereignty over East Timor, a recognition that was, by Australia's own subsequent acknowledgement, connected to negotiations over the oil and gas reserves in the Timor Sea that Australia wanted to develop jointly with Indonesia rather than with an independent East Timor. The UN never recognized the annexation. It also never enforced its own resolutions against it. For 16 years, East Timor's occupation proceeded largely outside international media attention. The territory was closed to foreign journalists for most of this period. What documentation existed came from refugee testimony, occasional reports from human rights organizations, and the work of a small number of advocates, including James Dunn, the former Australian consul, and journalists who managed limited access. This changed on November 12, 1991. A group of approximately 2,000 East Timorese marched through Dili to the Santa Cruz Cemetery to honor a young man who had been shot 2 weeks earlier by pro-Indonesian militia. Indonesian troops opened fire on the procession. As many as 270 people, most of them teenagers and young adults, were killed. What made the Santa Cruz massacre different from the thousands of killings that had preceded it across the previous 16 years was that it was captured on video by a British filmmaker who was present in the crowd. The footage was smuggled out of East Timor and broadcast internationally within days. For the first time, the world saw, not described in a refugee testimony, not summarized in a human rights report, but actually saw, in real time, on camera, Indonesian soldiers shooting unarmed civilians in the street. The footage produced international outrage that translated into pressure that had not previously existed. The United States Congress moved to restrict military assistance to Indonesia. International advocacy for East Timor, which had operated for over a decade with limited mainstream attention, found a global audience. In 1996, the Nobel Peace Prize was awarded jointly to Carlos Felipe Ximenes Bello, the Catholic Bishop of Dili who had documented and publicized the occupation's abuses from within East Timor, and José Ramos Horta, the exiled Fretilin diplomat who had spent 2 decades advocating for East Timor's cause internationally. The award was, among other things, an acknowledgement that the world had been slow to see what had been happening. The Indonesian dictatorship that had presided over the occupation began to collapse in 1998, amid the Asian financial crisis and mass protests that forced Suharto's resignation after 32 years in power. Indonesia's new government, under international and domestic pressure, agreed to hold a referendum on East Timorese independence in August 1999. Despite a campaign of intimidation and violence by Indonesian-backed militias in the lead-up to the vote, an overwhelming majority of East Timorese, approximately 78.5%, voted for independence. The Indonesian military's response to the result was a final, devastating wave of violence. Militias, working with Indonesian forces, killed an estimated 1,400 to 1,500 people in the weeks following the vote and destroyed the majority of East Timor's remaining infrastructure, schools, hospitals, government buildings, homes. An Australian-led international intervention force restored order. The United Nations administered East Timor for 2 years. East Timor formally became an independent nation, Timor-Leste, on May 20, 2002. The accountability for the preceding 24 years was, as with so many cases this channel has documented, partial. A serious crimes unit was established to prosecute crimes committed in 1999. Its scope was limited. Most senior Indonesian military commanders responsible for the broader occupation were never tried. A Commission for Reception, Truth and Reconciliation produced a comprehensive report in 2005, documenting the full scale of what had occurred and explicitly naming the United States, Australia, and the United Kingdom as complicit through their political and material support for the occupation. The report's findings were formally presented. They produced no prosecutions of the foreign officials named. The precise death toll of the East Timor occupation has never been definitively established. Estimates range from approximately 100,000 to over 300,000, out of a pre-invasion population of roughly 650,000. The range itself reflects the absence of systematic record-keeping during a quarter-century in which a foreign military controlled the territory and had every incentive to undercount what its forces had done. Even the most conservative widely cited estimates place the death toll at around 1 in 5 East Timorese killed during the occupation. The higher estimates, based on demographic analysis comparing expected population growth to actual census figures, suggest the toll may have approached 1 in 3. By either measure, East Timor experienced one of the deadliest occupations, proportional to population, of the 20th century. It happened with the knowledge, the weapons, and in the case of Australia, the formal diplomatic recognition, of 3 Western democracies that have spent the decade since presenting themselves as defenders of human rights on the world stage. Henry Kissinger died in November 2023, at the age of 100. He was never tried for his role in East Timor, or in any of the other episodes of his diplomatic career that scholars and human rights organizations have scrutinized in the decades since. The conversation in Jakarta on December 6, 1975, is part of the public record now. The request to wait until after the delegation had left is part of the public record now. Timor-Leste is an independent nation today. It is also one of the poorest countries in the world, still rebuilding from what 24 years took from it.